I'm Janessa Finley Ford, equal parts coach, healer, leadership strategist, and a very curious student of what makes us brilliantly human. I love psychology and neuroscience almost as much as I love a good laugh at my own expense, because let's be honest, mastering the art of being human really requires a healthy sense of humor. My work guides women out of stress leadership to self mastery that creates calm confidence and influential presence that changes families and teams and organizations. And I don't teach from a pedestal, I teach from the practice, and I have the bruises and the breakthroughs and the stories that show it. And thankfully, I get to have these conversations with one of my favorite humans. So let's meet the other voice behind this mission.
Hi, everybody, and I'm SJ. I'm a results driven leader who leads with conviction and strength, setting an unapologetic standard of excellence. I build high trust communities where candor and accountability forge dependable leaders. And as a certified crystal healer and shamanic earth and energy medicine practitioner, I blend science, spirit, and strategy together to rewire energetic patterns for peace, potency, and purpose.
Hmm. So, have you ever had a conflict with someone and within 30 seconds, your brain has already reached a verdict about the situation? You're either thinking, oh my gosh, what did I do? How did I contribute to this? What do I need to fix? Or you're thinking, okay, clearly we need to talk about their behavior. And honestly, both can feel incredibly reasonable when you're in the middle of it. So, welcome back to Eyes Wide Open. This is where SJ and I have a tendency to have vastly different approaches to nearly everything we do. Then we break it down and get real about what is actually going on here and how can you achieve the exact same things in life from completely different angles. And today we are talking about something that can really have a massive impact on your relationships, your leadership, your conflict style and your ability to bring your best to work. And that is how you process relational threat and how that interacts with your naturally programmed Enneagram defense mechanisms. And on our show, you always get two parts: the seen part, what you can actually observe, which in this conversation is going to look like the conversations you avoid or the feedback that you take personally, the boundary that suddenly becomes a battle, the decision that you second guess or triple guess or 10 times guess, and the person you're convinced is the problem. Now, the other part of our show that you get is the unseen part. What's underneath that? And in this conversation, that's going to look like the meaning your brain assigned to what actually happened, the threat your nervous system detected, the identity you suddenly felt compelled to protect with all of your might. And then, of course, your Enneagram jumps on in with its very particular strategy for making you feel safe, valuable, competent, loved, in control, and whatever else your particular personality has decided is absolutely a non-negotiable for you. So this is really where it gets fascinating because the same event can happen to two highly self-aware leaders, and one walks away thinking, I need to work on myself. That'd be me if you're curious in this duo. And the other will walk away thinking they need to work on themselves. And that would be SJ in this duo. And neither one actually has the whole story. So today we're going to get underneath the reaction because if you want to lead at your highest level, you need to understand not just what you do when you're triggered, but what's happening inside you that makes that behavior feel like the right thing to do. And for sure, SJ and I are going to be complete opposites throughout this whole conversation. So let's open our eyes.
This is definitely one of my favorite things was looking at this specific topic that Janessa brought up and found of the internal versus the external processor. And how valuable it is to know not only what you are, but also what your team is and what your boss is, so that you can preemptively go where they are going to naturally go, right? So If you know that your team member that you're talking to is an internal processor, you could literally start that conversation with this actually has nothing to do with you and there's no reflection upon you that we need to have. So let's like have a conversation about something else. If in fact that is what the conversation is about, right? If it's just a change in priorities or deliverables, you can preemptively set yourself up to not have to have that chaos or the misunderstanding that that individual may already be leaning into. I am for sure an external processor. So I look at things when items go poorly with what did the other person do or could have done differently. It also is things like maybe I just need a new job. Maybe I need to change something about my external environment. But my natural inclination is not to look internally. Um, I think we have an extraordinary gift as external processors to where we can see systems incredibly clearly. We can recognize when something isn't working and we can identify patterns in other people's behaviors. We can notice inconsistencies and we can separate ourselves enough from a situation to say, you know what, that's not actually mine. So I don't think with the external processor, you see a lot of over responsibility patterns showing up, which can become a bit of a problem and a hindrance for the flip side of the coin, right? I do, however, think with the external processors that accountability can be our issue. Like we lack the accountability aspects that probably those internal processors desire us to have. And it's not that we can't find them, but you have to be conscious enough to know that accountability is not your strong suit. And we're also amazing salesmen and women, right? Like we can pitch the why of why it's definitely not our fault and it's for sure them. Like we can do all of that. But that's going to hinder us in the long term, especially when you're in a leadership position where your team is going to rely upon accountability. And when you look at this too, the internal processor, I think, can fall into that trap where they internalize everything and they can stagnate some of their own ability to lead because of that, right? Whereas your external processor is just going to be out there losing trust left and right because we'll just spin the coin to a different like look, right? We'll spin the rhetoric, we'll spin the way that they move. So both internal and external processors have amazing gifts, but they also have some hindrances that really stagnate not just their own growth, but also their team's growth if they're not paying attention to it.
Absolutely. So, to bring this into context of what you might see in everyday life, to extrapolate a little bit on that over responsibility of the internal processor, you might notice a leader who overfunctions. They are anticipating everyone else's needs. They avoid the difficult conversations. They might take feedback, as an indictment, like this is more than just personal for them. They might absorb the responsibility that belongs elsewhere. And it's not uncommon for them to become resentful because nobody seems to notice how much they're actually carrying. Now, on the other side, with the external processor, you might see a leader who has really strong standards, like just holding a boundary, no big deal because they have a standard and they're not dropping below it, but their receptivity to other people might be rather low. So while their boundaries are high and their standards are high, their receptivity is a little bit softer. They confuse boundaries with demands. So while they have what they believe are really firm boundaries, other people may receive that as them being quite demanding. Their experiences with disagreement might get blurred with disrespect. They believe people are the primary source of dysfunction. This word dysfunction, I was listening to some leadership content, of course, as I do on the regular, and they were talking about how, really good leadership doesn't spread their dysfunction. And I know we've had this conversation a little bit. It doesn't necessarily go internal to external processor, but when I learned family dynamics and I looked around the workplace, it was so eye-opening because those patterns of dysfunction can be so interwoven into all of your interactions with people. And you're actually around your coworkers as many hours in a week, if not more, than what you're around your family, that it just shows up in the workplace. So if you're not able to take some inventory of your own dysfunction, you're just going to be sharing it. And this might be one instance where sharing is not necessarily caring.
My favorite phrase.
Yes. The external processor might have difficulty receiving corrective feedback, but it'll be pretty easy for them to give it. And they'll attract that compliance rather than genuine engagement from people around them. So, to just bring that into the everyday dynamic of what you're seeing in the leaders around you, if you check those inventories, you'll have a pretty good idea whether or not the leaders around you are internal processors or external processors. And then there's a conversation about internal processors and external processors and the Enneagram. And we've gone really deep into this topic within our community in Stronger Together this month. And there is so much to get into that we certainly won't be able to do it here in a whole hour. So I also am not going to go, I'm going to go through each Enneagram type really quickly because that core personality strategy that each type has, when combined with whether they're an internal or external processor, has a theme. So I'm just going to share the themes. It might help you recognize yourself or, again, a leader around you. But there's so much deeper dive to be had here that we're just going to cover the theme of them. So the type one, if it's an internal processor, you're going to hear, I need to be better. Where if they're an external processor, you're going to hear that someone needs to be better. The two's theme is, how did I fail you? And really being curious so that they can fix it. Where if they're external processor, they're going to be asking, after everything I've done for you, dot, 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 how did things end up this way, right? How could you? The threes are going to show up with a theme of, how did I fail if they're internal, or they don't recognize excellence because I definitely deliver the excellence. Type fours are going to question what's wrong with me if they're internal, or they're going to project, you don't understand me if they are external processors. Our fives, of course, they should have known more, or if they're external, they don't know what they're talking about. And this one makes me laugh so hard because I see this so clearly in the fives that I work with regularly. The sixes are going to ask, what did I miss? Because, of course, they're looking for that safety and contingency plan. And if they're external, they're going to ask, who created the threat? Sevens are going to be looking at, how did I create this if they're internal processors? And external processors are going to ask, why are these people making everything so difficult? Our eights, who are internal, are going to question, maybe I'm too much. And if they're external, they are going to be concerned about the people trying to control me. And then we have our nines. And our nines internally want to know, how did I contribute? And external processors, why can't everyone just calm down and be peaceful? So I do want to preface and own, when I first entered into this conversation with the Enneagram, I really felt like each type probably had a predominant processing type. And while I think that argument could probably be made, I think it's a lot more important to see how the two dynamics show up within each type, because there are internal and external processors for each Enneagram type. So I just want to set the record straight, since when I first came into this, I was looking at it from a different angle. And then when I started observing people in our community and the people around me, I quickly realized that I do see, whether maybe it's just the individuals God and the universe selects to bring into my life, dominant processing types for each Enneagram type. It's not the only one per Ennea type. What do you see with that, SJ? And how do you feel like this conversation fits into the Enneagram?
I think there are certain Ennea types where I have yet to see one over the other, right? Like I don't know that I've seen a seven wing eight that is an internal processor. I'm not sure I've seen an eight wing seven either that is an internal processor, but I did experience the flip side of those. An eight wing nine I saw that was an internal processor, and I saw a seven wing six that was also an internal processor. So I think the wings definitely come into play. And I also think where the individual is at on their own growth, self awareness journey is going to come into play as well. Because if people are really focused on growth and leadership skills, they're going to know what their weakness is, right? They're going to know that like their natural inclination is to project rather than absorb. And I think that is going to distort some of those results a little bit too, because the more self aware somebody is, the better at processing types of things like this are going to be. So I think I saw a little bit of both, but like I said, there were some very like predominant Ennea types that I've only seen one. I've only seen one of the internal versus the external processing, but I think it looks different. So when I leaned into the external, there was always like a focus on someone else. But what I noticed with other external processors, it was a lot of the environment rather than human focused, like not a someone focused, it was culture focused. So I did see a two that was clearly an external or externally processing at that time, to where it was the culture that that person brought up. Like, why is the culture not helpful? Why is the culture hindering us from being able to get the help that we need? Right. So, like, it's a two, right? But that was interesting for me to see an external processor with the Enneagram two, because before that, I probably would have told you Enneagram two is going to be entirely internalizing everything, which I think they typically do. But that person was comfortable interacting with me to where perhaps even the comfortability of that individual with the other person will allow them to flip between what their natural predisposition is to where it was safe enough for them to express that they felt like the culture was the problem of the organization, and that's why things were going poorly. And I think that comes into play a lot too. It depends on how comfortable the other individual is of how they're going to express themselves with you, right? I know lots of I don't know lots of seven wings eights, let's be real. I know some sevens though who don't say what they think to other people. And I think it's because they've been predispositioned to know that it's pain, right? And a seven likes to move away from pain. So if it's more painful to express themselves, I have seen a few in the workplace that have stopped expressing. And I think that's one aspect that I want to touch on with internal and external. Just because they aren't vocalizing the external doesn't mean they're not still externally processing. They're still blaming the external environment, people, places, things, whatever. They just aren't vocalizing it. So, not every external processor is going to hit you in the face like a seven wing eight will, right? Like, they're not going to always tell you that they're blaming you or something else for why things went south. And I think that's really important to understand within this conversation, is just because they're not telling you doesn't mean that they're automatically an internal processor. Like it's not a correlation at all to each other.
Absolutely. I was chatting with someone about this topic who had listened to some of our content and brought that up and said that it really helped them realize that someone that they knew, talked everything out, like every single word that was on their mind. And I was thinking, oh, well, come to the radio show because we're going to take this a level deeper. And I think that a lot of people do stop there with that concept or what they think of when we talk about internal versus external processing, of it being the behavior, like the
Mhm.
physical way that they're moving through something. But we're really talking about our internal landscape, the unseen, of course, because that's what we're about here. And there tends to be a drive for connection, right? All of us as humans, we want connection, we want companionship, and we want these things that make us feel safe. And the internal processor and the external processor, even in the way that they're processing things, they're making bids for connection and trying to create that connection. But the internal processor will do so through self-abandonment. So they will let other people's the experiences around them, I shouldn't say other people's, but they'll let whatever experience plays out create meaning about them, like SJ introduced us to, and go down this deep rabbit hole of what they need to fix about themselves, which can just lead to this hamster wheel of healing, balancing, reprogramming, shifting on end. And to an extent that they really do lose sight while they feel like they are pursuing betterment of themselves in some way, they're self-abandoning at the end of the day because not everything is this radical responsibility of their fault and something that needs changed, which we haven't gotten to it yet, but clearly there's a third way to go about things because on the other side, the external processor, I think their method to try to create that connection that we all desire so deeply is to accommodate. Now, we've been sitting here asking the question over and over again for external processors of what are other people doing wrong or how are other people creating this? But they will also want people to meet them where they are so that things feel comfortable for them. And a way to be able to do that is to accommodate. At the end of the day, neither of those strategies are really sustainable. But before I move on, since you are actually the lived expert of external processing, what do you feel like the connection is made through? Do you feel like you agree with accommodation or do you think it's something else?
I feel like I can see how accommodation can come into play. Accommodation wouldn't have been what I would have probably used as a word for how we seek out the connection. And honestly, it kind of shocked me a little bit when you said accommodation, because I'm like, man, when I'm external processing, accommodation is not really on my mind of this is what we're trying to do. Um, I think that an external processor, the way they try to seek connection is by saying the chaos is outside of them and the other individual that they're talking to. So they create the like we're in this together persona if connection is what they're going for, right? So I think
Mhm.
they create the chaos to be something that is outside of the two individuals or the three individuals or however many individuals are on that call or having that conversation to where it's an us versus them mentality. I think that is often created by an external processor. Um, I mean, external processing is not always balanced though, right? And it's not always going to be to create connection.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, like when I heard you say accommodation, I was like, ah yes, I'm trying to accommodate my own sense of moving away from pain, which if I can push the threat further away, that accommodates me. So like when you said accommodation, I'm like, yeah, accommodation is internal though. I'm accommodating me and not the other person because I need this to just end or be over. Whereas, I think the internal processor, what they're trying to do for connection is with the other person or for the other person while abandoning themselves. So I think the external abandons the other people while accommodating themselves. So, yes, when I flip it like that, yes, absolutely. Trying to accommodate my own move away from pain. That's more Enneagram 7, right? So that's my Enneagram coming into the aspect too. But I think any external processor is trying to accommodate whatever makes them feel that sense of safety, calm, peace, whatever, so that they can regulate their own, internal environment that they're currently ignoring at that time.
Yeah, that's really intriguing. And of course, the self-abandonment of the internal processor is not a balanced example either. Like,
Right.
this is when we are out in the weeds. But what I've really observed with the external processors with accommodation, and I think you bring up such a really in-depth paradigm with this concept, especially with the inner world versus what's seen externally, is I will see external processors accommodate the things that will get the other person to move in the direction that they want them to go, to have that, okay, everything is okay here, so now I'm okay. So it's not necessarily an accommodation of I'm going to give you what you're asking or I'm going to give you what you want. but it's this accommodation of what can we agree upon and what can I give you that will get you to where I want you to be. And I guess in some ways people might say, they're just kind of handling the other individual. But again, we're talking about in the non-balanced state. So this isn't something that you're necessarily going to see in every situation or conflict either. Where do you want to take the conversation from here?
I
Any
think the most
preference?
interesting thing is when the two opposites come together, right? Like when you have an internal processor who is having to interact with an external processor. And I think in a very balanced relationship, it feels great. I think it's very harmonious. I think the other is an amazing mirror for the opposite individual to where you can see the like strength and weaknesses of each other to where you can amplify the strengths of each individual while also lovingly bringing to light the areas that require a little bit more handholding to get through. So I think when you have two balanced individuals, it can be absolutely beautiful how those two can interact together. I think it can also be highly destructive and quite the fascinating dance when you have one and or both, God forbid both, that are imbalanced and triggered in that moment. Because I think then often you start to see the blame game and the weird explanations happen to where the external processor is going to do things like, here's what you did wrong. Here's everything. Like, here's a list of all of the things that you should have done differently. And then that poor internal processor is thinking, like, let me examine that. Let me figure out, like, just dying inside. And what I find the most interesting is the external processors on the outside can be losing their whole shit, like, absolutely losing it, and internally nothing is happening and they're probably like going to sleep just fine, whereas internal processor is over there in stoic robot mode, externally has all the shit together, looks like they're composed, looks like nothing is flustering them, and internally they are just dying, like
Mhm.
absolutely dying inside. So it's also interesting to me like how the external does not mirror the internal of what's happening, and it's quite the opposite for both individuals, right? And I think that an internal processor often, when they're in that imbalanced state, has a natural inclination to just say things like, "You're right, I could have handled that better." Like they just want to move off of, I'll take responsibility for it and then I'll move forward. And then that stupid external processor experiences confirmation of like, see, I knew it was them. Even they know it was them. They've just agreed with me that it was them, right? So then it just keeps going because then the internal processor is like, I just took accountability for not just my part, your part, all the parts. And you're telling me now that, hey, external processor, you have no accountability or responsibility. Like, hold on, wait 1 minute. Like, you're saying there's nothing that you are accountable for in this, right? To where then, of course, like that external processor is like, well, hey, I mean, you agreed with that. You just said this was all your fault and that I was right. So if you agree with it, why would I disagree with it? And then it's just that toxic, like, roundabout to where
Right.
somebody's going to get exhausted, right? Like somebody's going to get tired first, and probably that has more to do with your Enneagram than your internal or external processing system. But either way, nobody comes out of that state balanced or having bettered themselves or the people around them. And if you look at that too, if everyone around you keeps accommodating, apologizing, adjusting, and questioning themselves, external processors, you may never encounter enough resistance to actually examine yourself to where just going to stay stagnant at that 14-year-old trapped self when mommy and daddy made you sad that day, right? Like you're just never going to move forward. And the internal processor is just going to sit and spin and lose sleep at night, not be able to eat, have all of those things of like, oh my God, like, what did I do so wrong to have deserved this? What can I do differently? How do I never do that again? To where they're just spinning their wheels, which I mean, I can relate to what the external processor does in these moments, but what happens to you when you've experienced those moments of spin out with an external processor?
As far as the question confuses me, so I'll just answer it both ways. So what I experience is the dying inside. For sure, what you explained about the stoicism usually on the outside, unless people know me really well, I'm sure that they can observe my tells. But if they don't, I'm going to be pretty much a statue, not move a whole lot, not give a whole lot of facial expressions,
Mhm.
and just let the whole swirling in my inner world it's just there. And the inner critic of the Enneagram one also shows up really quick and starts telling me, oh, this part is inadequate, or this you shouldn't have done, or that. Then on the other side of that, what do I experience with the external processors is the for sure, like if we want to call it the blame game, I think those were your words. Love
Yeah.
it. We'll go with that. And the quicker that you agree with them, the just the quicker that you're going to move on. And I'm not saying that agreeing with someone to appease them is necessarily the best way. But also sometimes, depending upon how triggered people are in the moment, sometimes taking the path of less resistance in that moment so you both can come back clear-headed. And maybe for both of you, because as SJ mentioned, oftentimes for the external processor, it's not because their inner world is swirling, it's the external, darts being thrown or the blame being assigned that needs to take a chill pill while the internal processor needs to go regulate themselves and then come back to it with a clear head. And really, what we're highlighting here more than anything else is that, healthy leaders can tolerate the discomfort of someone being disappointed in them, someone being upset with them, someone having negative emotions about them without immediately making themselves either wrong or making the other person wrong about the situation. And so if you can't show up to a situation, whatever you're navigating in that moment, not allowing it to have meaning, if you're looking for a solution or you're noticing the other person isn't able to just look for a solution at that time, then sometimes it's best to take the pause and come back to it so that you both can have a little time to process and reevaluate and have a stronger foundation to move forward on rather than in the moment of the chaos and the swirling.
Mhm.
Not always in the workplace do you have that luxury. Like we talk about that a lot here to make the space whenever you can. And also, let's be real, we've all been in meetings where you're put on the spot or something spins up in real time and you have to think on your feet. You have to respond in the moment. And it's not always a situation where you can be like, yeah, let's just come back to this tomorrow or in a couple hours. Sometimes you don't have access or availability to that person, and you have to move forward through the discomfort. And that's why we teach what we teach. And that's why we have the tool sets that we have, because we know that life happens in real time. And as much as it's nice to take a pause and step away from things and regulate and come back, we also want people to have the tools to be able to move through life in real time when you don't have the opportunities and you're also not dropping the ball in the moment when the pressure heats up.
Yeah, and I think that's critical. No skill set should be foundationally built while you're triggered. So I don't think we should ever practice a new skill during the trigger. Like you build the muscle pre-game, right?
Yes.
You don't try to build it during the game. Like that's how you get fucked up, right? Sorry, Mama Finley, I'm trying to do better. But, like when you're trying to build like these new skills or utilize these new tools and things like that, don't do it in the moment. Discern ahead of time, like figure out right away. Are you an internal or are you an external processor? Great. If you're an external processor, shut your mouth. Like that's the first start. Don't open that right away. Give yourself a minute and say, great, you know what? I have identified what everybody else could have done differently. Go me. What could I have done? Like, where was my part within this? Was there somewhere that I could have intervened, coached, directed, instructed, whatever? Is there something that I could have done differently in various moments that would have changed this trajectory? So that you can take ownership of those items. And then also, sometimes we don't, and honestly, I would say most of the time, we probably don't need to figure out who's to blame or what is necessarily to blame. Like sometimes that's not the best course of action. Sometimes the best thing is to say, what can we do together moving forward to never experience this again? Like, how do we move through this and not repeat the same poor example? In the internal processor, of course, you guys are going to immediately fall into how it's your fault and become over responsible. Great, do all of those things. And then I want you to look outside and say, was my team poorly trained? Could I have done that better? Could I have given them different resources? Could I have given them, could they have had instruction, or did they have, excuse me, did they have instruction that they just didn't follow? Like, where did they do the things that we can look at holding accountability from both ends, right? If those items were hit, you're always going to find something you could have done better. Like, you're never not going to be able to identify that because we're never perfect always, right? And I think sometimes we like to pretend, or find the reason that something occurred. And I think it's easiest often for us to say things like it's a person than it is for us to acknowledge it's a culture, or the standard of where we're at is creating some of this dysfunction, right? Because shit trickles downhill. So the likelihood that it's just one leader that is causing issues for everybody beneath them, it's probably not reality, right? Like, there's probably a cultural aspect to the place and space that we're in that is feeding whatever this dysfunction, disharmony, chaos is, right? Because you've probably heard that, like, one monkey doesn't stop a show. It's true, right? So, like, when did many monkeys begin participating in the show? And how do we get them to dance to a new dance, by the way, because it's not working? So, often looking at the culture, the standards, and the boundaries of respect that we either have or are lacking in are going to be far better than not repeating the same problem areas over and over again, than identifying where Bob forgot to, what, I don't know, press a button, forgot to insert code here, right? Like, is it the system that's the problem? Normally it's systems rather than just one individual that's causing an issue.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure in the workplace, going to the systems is certainly a much stronger approach. I feel like we talked about that in the last episode too. I really feel like as we go through this conversation, one of the things I want to highlight between the dynamics of the internal external processor, I know this is rewinding the clock just a little bit, because Ashley talked about this and how toxic or how complementary it can truly be. One of the greatest things SJ has really given me is the gift of a balanced sense of responsibility, because especially in my pursuit of growth and greater capacity, and knowing that the things that are occurring in my life, I'm typically the common denominator of, because I'm the one always with me, showing up in everything. I can remember countless conversations earlier in our business partnership, friendship, relationship, where I would say, well, this thing happened and it shows that I'm so impatient, or like the meaning that I made about it would come out immediately after I mentioned whatever the circumstance was. And I would tell myself I was absolutely convicted and convinced that I had something that I needed to shift within myself so that this wouldn't ever happen again. And sometimes we would do the healing work, we would balance, we would process the emotions, and the situation would happen again the next week. And I'm like, what in the world gives here? Like, I'm doing the stuff. How is this still happening? Because I believe in this work. And really, when I'm able to now see in hindsight, because things are always clear in hindsight, is really the difference of the over responsibility, where, okay, I did my part. And now is where I need to really assert a boundary. I need to assert myself and take action, move forward, and not let the external processor continue to have this repeated story that I'm the one to blame, because then I'd be like, oh, yeah, because that's how it works. So I'm going to go do the work now. And then exactly what she had shared earlier, the external processor would be like, huh, I'm not accountable for anything. Cool. There's nothing to see here. There's nothing to do here. I'm going to live in bliss and sleep well at night.
Mhm.
And I was caught in this complete cycle of carrying the whole load of that conflict, if you want to call it a conflict, or the professional relationship that was not really very professional, if we're being honest.
Mhm.
And that is when I really needed to assert, like, actually, this is the line, and these are your responsibilities, and these are my responsibilities on the other side of the line. And if we both come to the table with what is ours, this is going to be a lot easier for both of us. And that is really also the example of the third type of processor, who we could call is like an evolved processor or a conscious processor,
Mhm.
where you can look at the situation objectively. You don't have to immediately make meaning about it. That if you're an internal processor, this is much more you. That, I'm bad, or I guess the external processor, they're bad. Very much Enneagram 1 example for everyone right there. Just comes right to the top of the mind, like clockwork. But whatever situation you're navigating through, there's not a negative meaning immediately assigned. It's just the situation happened. And you can be honest, it's affected me. And within taking inventory or reflecting on how it's affected you, you can own the feelings, you can own the emotions that you're processing, because those are real and you need to process through that as it happens in real time. And then you can also say, yeah, I contributed to this, because if I was involved in the situation, I had a contribution, but I'm not the sole contributor to it, and not everything is my fault. And on the other side of that coin, of course, is not just the other person. You contributed to this. It's all your fault. But instead, it's, how did each of us contribute to the situation? And then what is the solution? Because if you don't ever get to the solution, and I can't even wait for the day that we have a conversation about repair. SJ brought that topic up recently, and I'm like, oh my gosh, repair in the workplace is such an incredible conversation to have, because that can look so different for many people, and oftentimes repair never happens, even though you think maybe it has. But if you're not looking for solution, you're never going to have solution, nor even have an opportunity to move forward to repair, which is really the healthiest place to be after any situations in the workplace or within leadership. So the first step to take in getting there is identifying, how do you process? And then where would your tweak be to find that balanced third perspective, where you can assess how everyone contributed, including yourself, including other people, and then be able to really take responsibility from there and move forward, finding that resolution that's going to work for everyone. And it really allows you also, one last thought, to stay connected to yourself and the other person, right? So some time ago, I brought up the concept that we all want connection, because we do. But if you're not coming into these processing dynamics with a really healthy sense of self and holding that objective standpoint, you're not actually going to end up connected in all of the ways. Like, you might end up connected to the other person while self-abandoning as the internal processor, or you might end up really connected to yourself, but not so much other people as the external. But when you are showing up in that more evolved processing state, then you can remain connected to your truth and to yourself. And you will also be much more relatable and much more connected to the other people around you.
Yeah, I think one of the key things that I kind of want to just leave us with here tonight too is the next time you're triggered, before deciding whether it's you or them, you can ask simple things like, where did your attention go first? Like, what did your thoughts or your feelings do first? Did I immediately start investigating myself, or did I immediately start investigating them? And then deliberately go in the opposite direction. If you're an internal processor, ask, what if this isn't entirely mine? What happens then? What happens then to the way you navigate it? What happens then to the solution? Like, what if it just isn't entirely yours to hold? And what behavior from the other person deserves examination? When we're in leadership roles, we do have to examine not just our own behaviors, but other people's behaviors too. and then going a little bit deeper and saying, what am I taking responsibility for that belongs to someone else? You know, if you bailed that team member out 5 million times and covered for them, maybe this is, the 5 million then one time where they have to take full responsibility for their lack of whatever that occurred for that situation. And it just is what it is. Because I think the internal processors do an amazing job of protecting other people while leaving themselves out to dry often. And then moving in the other direction, if you're an external processor, what if some of this is mine? Let's start small. It might all be yours, but like let's start really small though with what if some of it is yours?
Which morsel?
Yeah, which tiny little piece can we choose to be ours and now blame on something else, right? And that blame could be like, well, I didn't have enough training. Don't do that either. Like if you catch yourself like, sure, this piece is mine, but if they would have provided the training to me on this day, then it wouldn't have happened. Okay, you're still projecting, right? When really the growth edge is to look at the internal environment of, could you have advocated for yourself earlier and said you needed that training before making the decision? Yeah. I mean, we could play this game forever, right? And also, what might they be experiencing from me? Like, what is the other person, our team members, even our bosses, what are they experiencing from me? What did I contribute? And what would I see if I stopped building my case for 5 minutes? Like, if I stopped trying to build the strategy and the case of how I'm going to spin this, what would I see? Like, what knowledge would be there for me to find? Of course, that's a head point one, but I feel like we can see that because neither processor needs to abandon our natural gifts, right? In fact, you should lean into them, but you also have to develop access to the other one to really have your gift be a strong point and not turn into a weakness. So you have to be able to see the other side of the coin. You can't play heads or tails with just heads, right? Like, you gotta have both. You gotta be able to see both of them.
I don't know. I feel like building your case might not be just a head point. Like I can for sure see this in some gut points as well. Perhaps myself because I'm an internal processor, but yeah, I love those questions. And I love, we come back to these themes every show that are simplistic because they work and they're so valuable. Like simply being curious instead of just letting that normal rhetoric and narrative in your head that likes to run free like wildfire do its thing. Intentionally think some thoughts, ask yourself some questions, probe around in there, challenge
Mhm.
your perspective, and great things can come from that. It will come from that. Is there anything else that you wanted to add before we move into wrapping it up for today?
I think just people who like journaling and self-reflection, just one final comment of really looking at what belongs to me, what belongs to you, and what belongs to the dynamic between us. I think can give a lot of insight to relationships, whether it's work or intimate relationships. I don't think it matters, but I think looking at all three sides of that can give a lot of info.
For sure. And if nothing more, they might be completely lopsided, and you're going to immediately see where your processing is, even if like I love journaling when it brings me to like, oh, that's definitely a lie that I've been believing,
Yep.
right? Those things start popping out, but sometimes journaling is just the awareness of,
Mhm.
oh, wow, what they talked about in that episode is really happening right now in real time. So I love those three simple reflections to sit with and see what it shows about yourself. So this episode, I feel like we really extended an invitation to you to really pay attention to what happens inside you before you decide what's happening between you and someone else, especially when you're triggered, when they're triggered. In this episode, we talked about how the internal and external processing shapes the way that we experience those relational threats and how the Enneagram can take that processing pattern and give it its own unique flavor. And sometimes we turn everything inward and decide we're the problem if we're the internalizer. And sometimes we turn everything outward and build a pretty compelling case for why they're the problem. And sometimes, especially when we're stressed, we confuse our defense mechanism with leadership. And we try to pass off our defense mechanism as our boundary or as our leadership style. And so the deeper work is learning to get curious with yourself, to start asking yourself some questions, to move into that third position so that you can be really objective about what is playing out, taking accountability for you, seeing how the other person or people are playing into the scenario as well. Because that's where leadership gets, really interesting. It's not that we're never going to be triggered as much as that would be lovely, and we get triggered a lot less when we do this inner work. But leadership is really about when you get triggered and you can do so without abandoning yourself or without outsourcing yourself. So if you're out there listening and you're thinking, all right, I am definitely hearing what they're saying and I'm seeing exactly where I do this and I'm ready to actually shift it, then here's our shameless plug for Stronger Together, because we also have an invitation for you in this episode to come join us inside Stronger Together. The thing that we overhear from our members so often is that they're not just learning about themselves anymore. It's not just that they become more aware of themselves anymore. They're catching their patterns in real time. They're interrupting them before their pattern runs the show in that really annoying way that it's done time and time again that they couldn't break out of. They feel more regulated, they feel more confident, and they're finally moving through places where they have been stuck for years and being able to make conscious decisions and choices about their behavior that they never thought that they would be able to do because they thought they were going to loop in that same habit for the rest of their lives. So the courses in Stronger Together, they give you the framework. The community gives you the perspective and the support. And those live pattern interrupting calls, that's where things get real. And that's where you get to shift in a way that will really allow you to return home to yourself, to the person that you always knew you were meant to be. So if you're ready to stop collecting self-awareness like it's a hobby and start experiencing yourself differently, come inside Stronger Together, because awareness is powerful, but awareness that changes how you live and lead and love and respond, that, my friends, is transformation. You can grab your seat by visiting www.strongertogetherinstitute.com. And we will be back here the second week of September. And until then, keep your eyes wide open.